Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. On a snowy December day near Oakley, Utah, in a beautiful valley with a river and breathtaking views, an unthinkable crime was committed against a family spending time in their cabin, the place they called heaven on earth. What was once their heaven would become a hell, and after two evil men were finished, the family would be changed forever, and their cabin, called Tiede's Tranquility, would be the scene of a massacre. This is the story of what happened to the Tiede family, known as the Utah Cabin Murders. Let's get into it. December 14th, 1990. Two parolees living in a halfway house in Salt Lake City were assigned to spend the day looking for employment in the area. The men were Vaughn Lester Taylor, who had been imprisoned for 15 years for aggravated burglary, and Edward Stephen Deli, who was serving 5 years for arson. The men had earned their way, with good behavior, to the halfway house where they were ordered to finish their sentences. On the day they were released and tasked with finding employment, they chose instead to walk away from the halfway house and go on the run. They had been on the run for over a week, and they were in need of food and money and a vehicle. The men hitchhiked up to Weber Canyon, just north of Salt Lake City, and they were looking for a way to get the things they needed. About 2 miles off the main road, they spotted a cabin off in the distance in a very quiet location, and they formed a plan. December 22nd, 1990. The Tiede family had gathered at their beautiful cabin in Weber Canyon near Oakley, Utah for the Christmas holidays. Rolf Tiede and his wife Kay were looking forward to spending time with their daughters, 20-year-old Linae and 16-year-old Tricia, as well as with Kay's mother, the girls' grandmother, Beth. The cabin was the family's favorite place to be, and Kay had lovingly prepared it for Christmas, even hanging the family's stockings by the fireplace. The cabin was all dressed up and looked like something in a Christmas storybook. It was in such a remote location that it could only be reached by snowmobile during the winter. There were a few errands left to run to prepare for the extended family that would be joining the Tiedes later on, cousins and aunts and uncles. The family left the cabin to finish some last-minute Christmas shopping in Salt Lake City, about an hour away. They had no way of knowing that their absence was just what the two parolees were waiting for. As soon as the family left their cabin, Vaughn Taylor and Edward Stephen Deli broke in. Once they were inside, they helped themselves to not only the family's food, but the family's Christmas presents as well. Deli used the cabin phone to call a friend of his, and he told that friend, "I'm getting ready to shoot some people." The two escapees made themselves at home, and they even began tearing through the gifts the family had purchased for each other. At one point, Stephen Deli noticed the family's video camera. He grabbed that video camera and began taping what was going on. Deli recorded Taylor as he ripped through the gifts, and the two talked about one of them, which was an album full of baseball and football cards. "Elway, Marino, where's Sims?" "Yeah, my boy," Deli said as Taylor held up the book to show the camera. Then he said, "Where's Bird? That's my boy too." The full tape has never been released to the public, but investigators describe it as a sickening invasion of privacy and intrusion at the home.
I don't know. Okay. I don't think I got all of this.
How come your light flashing on the front of that?
I don't know.
Find out.
How am I supposed to find out?
Read the instructions. And Linae. Come on, pass them. Oh, wow.
What is it?
Baseball card.
Okay. Let's see a couple of them.
Oh, the football and basketball.
Show them this way. Turn them this way. Okay. Next page.
When the Tiede family was finished with their errands in Salt Lake City, they drove back up to their cabin in separate vehicles. First to arrive were Linae, her mother Kay, and her grandmother Beth. Linae said her hands were freezing after being on the snowmobile, and she wanted to run them under hot water. She told her mother and grandmother that she would be right back to help them with the gifts and the other things they had brought back to the cabin. She ran upstairs towards the kitchen, but at the top of the stairs, she saw something gray, a flash of movement. She immediately thought it was one of her cousins, who had already arrived and was hiding in the cabin to jump out and scare her. Instead, Von Taylor stepped out in front of her wearing a gray hoodie. He was holding a gun and he pointed it directly at Linae. Tiede then came in from outside and made her way to the top of the stairs. At that point, Edward Deli came from the bedroom carrying a gun, which he pointed at Kay. Kay began saying, "What do you want? Why are you here? I'll give you whatever you want." The men didn't even answer Kay. They just started shooting. Linae stood and watched in horror as her mother was shot and fell to the floor. Just behind Kay was Linae's grandmother, Beth. She too was shot in the head and fell to the ground. Linae then heard something and her heart sank as she realized the sound she heard was snowmobiles approaching the cabin, and on those snowmobiles was her father and her sister. Linae realized she might have time to do something. She told the men that there was a car in the garage. She showed them where the keys were and told them, "I'll take you to the car." She was trying to think of any way she could get the men out of the cabin before her father and her sister arrived. One of the men put his gun into Linae's back and began walking her outside. So now Linae, Taylor, and Deli were in the garage, but Linae couldn't get them to take the car and leave. The snowmobiles grew closer and closer, and Linae was forced to stand there quietly, knowing what her father and her sister Tricia were walking into. I think these crimes make me the angriest of all. You are in your own home, a home that you worked for, a home that you paid for, a home that you've sacrificed for, and some piece of garbage comes into that and ruins your life, ruins your family's lives, ruins that special place for you. It makes my blood boil. If you've ever been robbed, if you've ever had anybody break into your house and steal from you, you know how angry that makes you. Imagine if they came in and hurt and killed people that you loved. It would just be overwhelming anger, but for me anyway. The men kind of hid, and as soon as the snowmobiles reached the garage, they jumped out of the garage, pointing their guns at Tricia and Rolf Tiede, yelling, "Don't move, don't do anything, get inside the house." Linae later said, "My dad looked at me and he saw the tears in my eyes, and he knew that something awful had happened to Mom and Grams." The men then asked Rolf Tiede if he had any money. Rolf emptied his pockets and threw all of the cash he had on the ground. Von Taylor then told Edward Deli to shoot Rolf. Deli pulled the hammer back on the gun, but he wouldn't shoot Rolf, so Von Taylor then raised his weapon and fired. The gun clicked but did not fire, so he pulled the trigger again, and again it did not fire. He pulled the trigger a third time, and this time the gun went off. Tricia said the gun blast was so loud right by her head that her ears rang. Her father had been shot. They dragged Rolf Tiede up the stairs and left him bleeding on the ground. He lay very still, pretending to be dead. As Tricia and Linae looked around the cabin, they saw very clearly that the men had been in that cabin for some time. They saw that the men had eaten and had opened their Christmas presents. They also saw that Taylor and Deli had brought gas cans in from the garage and set them around the cabin. That must have been really scary to see. They knew what they were going to do. The men were, of course, preparing to burn the cabin down and destroy all evidence of their crimes. The two men grabbed the gas cans and started spreading gasoline all through the house, and then they lit it. The smoke alarms began to scream as Linae and Tricia watched helplessly. The fires grew bigger, and the men told the girls, "Help us load the snowmobiles. You're coming with us." They ordered the girls onto the fronts of the snowmobiles to drive, and both men got on the backs. Neither one of these tools could probably drive a snowmobile. The girls began driving through the snowy valley, and Tricia said, "I started to think, how can I crash into a tree to try to throw him off?" But then she realized she couldn't leave her sister. There was nowhere for them to escape to. They were in the middle of nowhere, and they were very much alone. As the snow machines approached the main gate to the property, the girls saw a figure standing there. It was their uncle, Randy Zorn, who had arrived for the holiday festivities. Randy began to wave, seeing the snowmobiles coming to greet him. He recognized his two nieces on the fronts of the snowmobiles driving, but then he saw the people on the back and he thought, well, maybe they brought their boyfriends. Randy started to walk towards the machines, but the girls didn't acknowledge him. They didn't stop their snowmobiles, they didn't wave, nothing. Randy was surprised. This is not what his nieces would normally do when they saw him, but the girls knew that if they told the men this was a family member headed to the cabin, the men would kill him. They were trying to save his life.
And then I seen the Lincoln come out across the street, and I go, well, there they are again. I was walking up to the car as they were pulling out, and I was actually looking in the back, and I think I seen Linae in the back. I waved my hands again. I go, stop. I knew something's wrong.
The girls finished driving the couple of miles down from the cabin onto the main road, where they came to the parking lot where people would leave their cars before packing in on their snow machines. The men began throwing their guns into the trunk of the car, and Tricia noticed that Taylor had a large knife in his jacket. He saw her looking at the knife, and he said, "Don't worry, I'm just as good with a knife as I am with a gun." The only thing this guy looks like he's good at is eating corn off a cob through a chain link fence. The parking lot where the family car was just next to the gate where the machines had passed Randy. Randy's still standing there confused, and he sees the family Lincoln come pulling out of the parking lot. So Randy is still standing there, waving his hands in the air and yelling, "Stop!" But the girls ignored him and pretended they didn't know who he was. Randy stood there stunned as his nieces drove right by him without even acknowledging him, but he was even more stunned at what he saw next. He heard another snow machine coming towards him, and on that snow machine was a man wearing nothing but a t-shirt in the bitter cold. He wasn't wearing gloves, he wasn't wearing a hat, no helmet, nothing that you would need to survive cold in the dead of winter in the northern Utah mountains. Randy thought to himself, who is this person? And then as he got closer, he realized it was his brother, Rolf. Randy was horrified as his brother got closer to him. He saw that Rolf's head was huge, swollen from his injuries, and he was covered in frozen blood. Rolf's eyes were almost completely swollen shut. He was driving basically blind in the bitter cold, chasing the men who had killed his wife and mother-in-law and had taken his daughters. Oh my gosh! The things we will do when our kids are in danger, isn't that something? Randy's vision was so impaired that he didn't even realize it was his own brother that he had come upon. He just saw a figure. He saw someone standing there. He said, "I've been shot. My wife has been killed and my daughters have been kidnapped." Randy says he flipped into full panic mode. He got his brother Rolf off of the snow machine and into his vehicle, and the two of them began flying down the canyon road, chasing the car with the nieces, Rolf's daughters, and the two killers inside. Randy said he had only two things on his mind: save the girls and get his brother onto a life flight helicopter. Randy sees the Lincoln ahead of him, and he pulls up to the back of the car. Then he realizes he doesn't really know what to do. I was really surprised to hear that Randy had a mobile phone in 1990. Those were not common back then, but he had one. Unfortunately, he couldn't get any kind of a signal. He tried calling 911 over and over as he raced down the mountain road. Suddenly, he hit a cell tower and a call went out. He had been connected with an operator. He tells the dispatcher what has happened, and she assures him they are sending police and sheriffs and ambulances their way. Randy guides the operator to their location as he drives, giving her kind of a play-by-play of what is happening and where they're at. Now, the killers do not realize that Randy is following them as they turn off of the mountain road heading towards Camas, Utah. Randy tells the dispatcher, "I need a helicopter." But just as he said that, his phone disconnected and the call was dropped. Randy pulled into the first gas station he saw and ran to the payphone. He called 911 back and told them, "Send a helicopter for my brother." Meanwhile, the sisters in the Lincoln with the killers continue on. Tricia remembers looking at the speedometer and seeing they were going over 90 miles an hour. They passed a police car, and the girls began to have a little hope as the police car whipped around and began to follow them. The men begin to panic, and they make a quick turn onto a small side road. They lost control of the vehicle, and it slid down an embankment, landing here off the road. As the car comes to a stop, Tricia recalled, "We looked back up onto the main road, and there was a solid line of not only cops, but local people all drawing down on the car. They were armed and had their guns pointed at us." She said, "I was amazed that there were so many people there that fast." Linae remembers thinking, what if they don't know we are hostages in the car and they start shooting at us? Tricia grabbed Linnæa's hand and yelled, "Duck." The two sisters held hands as they cowered in the car, not knowing what would happen next. Police descended on the car with their weapons drawn on Taylor and Deli. They dragged them from the vehicle, threw them down on the snow, and handcuffed them. Linae started screaming at the cops, "Shoot them, kill them now. They just killed my mom and my grandma." Tricia says she remembers feeling safer as the men were handcuffed, but she was still in shock. Back at the gas station, a helicopter arrived for Rolf. Randy unloaded his brother from the back of his Blazer and watched as the helicopter flew away with him, not knowing if he would ever see his brother again. Once the girls were safe and Rolf had been life-flighted to the hospital, investigators began to converge on the cabin. Officer Brad Wild said, "Hundreds of crime scenes later on, this one still ranks right up at the top for me. It is still very vivid to me." He recalled that as he entered the garage, he could smell burnt hair and blood. He started up the stairway and could clearly see bullet holes in the sheetrock along with a bloody handprint. He said the house looked like a mini war zone. He then found the bodies of Kay and Beth. He checked their pulse, but even before he did, he knew that they were gone. Unbelievably, the cabin had not burned down. It was still smoldering, so Officer Wild began trying to put out the remaining flames. He also spotted the video camera and knew he needed to make sure he got it out of the cabin in case the cabin ended up burning down. Joseph Offers, the lead investigator, arrived on the scene, and once they were sure that the cabin wasn't going to burn down, he put the tape in the VCR, expecting to see the family on it. Instead, he saw the killers. He had officers look into who the two men were, and it wasn't tough to find out their identities. Vaughn Taylor was only 25 at the time, and Edward Stephen Deli was just 21 years old. They had hitchhiked to the area from the halfway house and targeted the Tiede family because they knew they were there. The investigators had a challenge ahead of them. This was not a whodunit, but it was a complicated case because they had to find out which man committed which crime. And because there had been so many crimes committed, this was going to take some doing. They didn't want to make any mistakes. They did not want to end up with one of these monsters maybe getting off on a technicality. The daughters, Linae and Tricia, didn't much care which man had done what. They felt they were both equally guilty of the 10 felonies and multiple misdemeanors, and the girls made no secret of the fact that they wanted both men to get the death penalty. Vaughn Taylor made a deal. He pled guilty to 2 counts of capital murder in exchange for the state of Utah dropping all other charges against him. Vaughn Taylor, I don't know, there's something about this guy that makes me feel sick. He's reptilian. He's remorseless and void of all humanity. And luckily the jury saw what he had done, and they sentenced him to death twice. Shortly after Taylor's trial, Ed Deli went to trial as well. Deli had not made a deal. He was going to make the state try him. This caused a lot of anger and grief for Linae and Tricia because they were put on the stand and forced to testify. Not only were they forced to testify, prosecutors forced them to hold the guns that killed their mother and grandmother and demonstrate with the murder weapons just how Ed Deli and Vaughn Taylor held the weapons. That is not right. I don't care how bad you want a conviction. It's not right to make victims do things like that. I can completely understand why the girls were upset about that, 100%. But both Linae and Tricia were courageous and strong, and they did what was asked of them. But there was another witness as well. The courtroom fell silent as Rolf Tiede, this father, this hero, who had done the unimaginable to save his daughters, took the witness stand. Oh. Prosecutors described how Rolf, mostly blind, shot, bleeding and freezing, chased the killers who had taken his daughters. At the trial, it came out that the men had actually set Rolf on fire, and he laid there burning, playing dead. The second the killers took the girls out of the room, Rolf ran to the shower and turned on the water to put the fire on his body out. This man, he was really something. Taylor and Deli were so inept and so stupid, they didn't realize the gun they shot Rolf with was only birdshot. That's the reason he wasn't killed, thankfully. Rolf bravely testified against Ed Deli and detailed the horrific acts that had been committed against his family that day. When the trial was over, the jury handed down a verdict of guilty of second-degree homicide and sentenced Ed Deli to life in prison. How they arrived at that verdict, it's very frustrating. One juror, who obviously had no clue what they were doing, held out on the first-degree conviction. This kind of stuff makes me really angry. One person should not have the power to make that kind of a decision, because Ed Deli's crimes qualify in every legal regard as first-degree homicide, eligible for the death penalty. But this is what happened. Sometimes juries are put into a position where they're given a choice to choose something lesser, and that's not always the best thing. Sometimes I almost feel like it would be better to start over with another trial going for first-degree convictions rather than give somebody, a lesser verdict. I don't know, that's just my opinion. In 1992, Rolf Tiede filed a lawsuit against the state of Utah, making a claim of wrongful death for his wife and mother-in-law. Rolf's attorneys stated that their client believes the Department of Corrections also had a hand in causing the death of Kay and Beth by failing to recapture the two convicts it basically lost, and there are some real merits to this claim. Rolf told the court, "We feel this could have been totally prevented, but the state did nothing to protect us." Rolf's attorney told the court, "If there is ever a case where justice requires the state to be accountable for its slovenly conduct, it is this case." The court, however, found that the state had immunity under Section 633010, which states, "Immunity from suit of all governmental entities is waived for injuries proximately caused by a negligent act or omission of an employee committed within the scope of employment, except if the injury arises out of assault, battery, or false imprisonment." So in other words, an employee for the state might have screwed up, but you can't hold the state responsible for what its employees do. That is governmental immunity, and I think it's bullshit. I don't know why we allow the government to hold itself to different standards than we hold private businesses to. They're employers, they're holding people accountable. I understand that, and I also understand that it is ultimately tax dollars that go to pay these civil suits. The government should be forced to keep an insurance policy or a reserve set aside, not out of tax dollars, to pay for these claims. Don't get me started. The court then dismissed Rolf Tiede's complaint. So I have some thoughts on this, but I'm interested in how you feel about this. Not only this ruling, but governmental immunity in cases like this in general. I believe this is an important topic that is worthy of discussion. Why does accountability stop on the government level? Why are we not allowed to hold government entities responsible for negligence? It's troubling. Tricia, Linae, and Randy, their uncle, have spoken openly about how angry they are about the verdict on Ed Deli's case. In 2001, Ed Deli sent a letter to Linae. He stated that he was very sorry, that he has changed, and he is not the person he was when he killed Tricia's mother and grandmother. Well, Tricia didn't respond for 9 years, but finally she decided to write him back. She chose to forgive him because it was the only way she could move on with her life. She said it was a huge relief to let her anger go. I don't know if I could ever do that, but I completely respect her decision to handle this terrible tragedy in the way that's best for her. You just never know what you would do until you're put in that position, and I hope I never am. Linae has married twice, and her current husband, Nathan, and she have 9 children between them. She says she is a survivor and that she is happy. Linae has 2 children as well, and although she did have a brush with the law regarding one of those children, she seems to be doing well. Rolf Tiede and his daughters decided to rebuild the cabin where this awful event occurred. He told the girls, "Lightning strikes, but it never strikes twice in the same location. We're safe here." The family loves the cabin and spends a lot of time there. They have chosen not to let Taylor and Edward Deli take their special place away from them, and I respect that. They spent a lot of time enjoying their special place, their heaven on earth. Rolf Tiede was diagnosed with cancer and passed away in 2008, surrounded by his loving family. When Kay Tiede was murdered, her sister, Claudia Tidwell Nelson, really stepped in and became kind of a mother figure and a source of support for Linae and for Tricia. She really tried to help the girls heal the best that she could. Claudia wrote a book about the family's ordeal in 2011 called Murder, Death, and Rebirth: Astonishing Lessons Learned from Murder. In 2019, an independent horror film was made about this event, titled simply The Utah Cabin Murders. I watched it as part of my research for this episode. It's a low-budget film that's, I can't lie to you guys, it's a bad movie. And I found myself kind of irritated as I watched it. If you're gonna make a bad horror film, make a bad horror film. I like bad horror films sometimes, but don't say it's based on a real event and use that real event that has real victims for your film and then make a film that resembles in no way the real event. You know what I mean? The film doesn't even take place in the winter, probably from the looks of it because they didn't have the money to rent snow machines for a couple weeks. Anyway, I love all film, but yeah, this one missed the mark for me. It's on Tubi for free if you would like to watch it. Taylor's conviction was overturned in 2020, but then that decision was reversed, and he is now back on death row. His appeals are running out, and although a date has not been set, he is set to die by lethal injection, and when that happens, I will cover his execution on my playlist, Dining with the Damned. Edward Deli continues to appeal his conviction, but he will most likely never leave prison. Both men are right where they belong, locked away from the rest of the world where they cannot hurt anyone else. I hope the members of the Tiede family are healing the best way they can. If there is one thing for sure, it's that their folks love them and that their dad was a hero. He left a legacy of really beautiful bravery and love for his girls who lost their mom and their grandma on that awful day. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to support me. It helps a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.